Psychological research has shown that there are really four parts to an emotional situation. There's the subjective label, which is like joy, sadness, fear, disgust, surprise, these labels that we will put on our emotion. There's the physiological arousal that emanates out from the autonomic nervous system. Really, often at times it's some sort of fight or flight response. It's some sort of involuntary behavior that happens within you. There's the behavioral expression, which is more voluntary, the thing that happens with your body language and your face. And then there's the cognitive interpretation. That's the thing that's going on inside of your head during the emotional situation. For example, here we have a situation where a girl looks on her boyfriend with another girl. Her ex-boyfriend, I suppose it is. This is jealousy. She would have this subjective label of jealousy. Her physiological arousal might be sort of this feeling of emptiness in the pit of her stomach, maybe an increased heart rate, maybe some sweating. Her behavioral expression would be cast down face, possibly this look of disdain with the eyebrow here. And her cognitive interpretation would be something like, I thought he loved me. Another example here would be road rage. This guy's going around a roundabout and he gets cut off. And subjectively, he would label it as anger. Physiological arousal, probably more increased heart rate, maybe some sweating, maybe some muscle spasms. The cognitive interpretation is some sort of, this isn't fair kind of situation. And the behavioral expression is, of course, this look of anger on his face. Last but not least, here's disgust. This was a story a student told me once, that he was playing ice hockey and he fell down and another player ran over his finger with an ice skate. And every time I tell that to anyone, they wince. They have the subjectively labeled feeling of disgust. The physiological arousal is this visceral response right in the chest. The cognitive interpretation is some sort of visualization of that. And the behavioral expression, you've got this kind of crinkled nose, pulled back mouth, that kind of thing. So researchers understand that these are the parts, in general, of an emotional situation, but how they work together, there's different ways that you can explain that. So I'm going to go through an extended example of this shower monster to explain how researchers have disagreed throughout history on emotional situations. So here's a situation: you go into your bathroom and bam, there in your shower is a terrifying, poorly drawn orange monster with a fork and knife ready to eat you. Subjectively, you would probably label this as fear. So let's see what those things would be. We've got the subjective feeling of fear. The physiological arousal would be shaking, a tight chest, probably some sweating and increased heart rate again. Really, the height of a physiological response for this would be a panic attack. The cognitive interpretation would be some sort of, this thing is going to eat me. I'm not going to survive this situation. Really, understanding that this is a dangerous monster that's not going to be good for you. And the behavioral expression, you'd have your arms flailing, you'd be screaming, your facial expression might be a little strained. So, starting out, let's look at common sense theory. Common sense theory is just, if you asked a person on the street how emotion works, this is probably what they would say. They would say something like, well, he's shaking because he's afraid. You ask, well, why is he shaking? He's shaking because he's afraid. The emotion causes the arousal, if you put it simply. It really only takes into account the subjective label and the physiological arousal. It doesn't care about cognition and the behavioral expression. There's a little bit of trouble here, though. Well, if you're shaking because you're afraid, where did the fear come from? The person would probably say, well, the monster. Well, what happened between seeing the monster and being afraid? Was it just a cognitive interpretation of that? Well, then let's include some cognition. Did anything have to do with the behavioral expression? we'll see how researchers have looked into this and elaborated on this theory. First, we've got James Lange theory, which really just took common sense theory and flipped it. Simply, it's a stimulus that causes this bodily reaction, and the bodily reaction produces an emotion. So this guy would say, I'm afraid because I'm shaking. The subjective label of fear happens because of the physiological arousal of shaking. Still doesn't take into account the behavioral expression or the cognitive interpretation, but it makes a little more sense because something causes the emotion other than just the stimulus alone. So William James and Carl Lange they both kind of discovered this at the same time in the end of the 19th century. And it pretty quickly got elaborated on by Cannon and Bard. So Cannon-Bard theory, which is early 20th century, they're looking at simply they're saying the bodily reaction and the emotion, well, they happen at the same time. They had this idea that the thalamus, the part of the brain that receives the sensory information of the stimuli, sends out that message of the stimuli through the nervous system to the organs, that's where the physiological arousal would happen, and the amygdala, the emotional center of our brain, at the same time. So I'm shaking and I feel afraid at the same time. So Cannon-Bard, keep in mind that that's saying that the two things happen at the same time. Still not talking about behavioral expression or about cognitive interpretation at all. But the next one really takes it up a notch. Schachter Singer theory, sometimes called Schachter two-factor theory, sometimes called two-factor theory, sometimes called cognitive arousal theory. I know that's a lot, but just remember this guy Schachter and Singer. These guys, they are the ones who came up with this one. And it takes into account, for the first time, cognitive interpretation. And they've actually run some good experiments I'll explain here. So simply this is, we think about the stimuli and our bodily reaction, and we decide on how to feel. So that decision there, it's not like the person's oh, I see this monster and I think it's dangerous and I should be afraid. No, it is a split-second blink-type decision. I perceive the monster to be dangerous and I'm shaking and I'm afraid is all at once. You can pretty easily see how with natural selection, if that decision took a long time, our fight or flight response would not engage and we would be eaten by dangerous creatures such as this. And that would remove our genetic material from the gene pool, and no one would have that trait of taking their time with this decision anymore. The hesitation gets weeded out. So these decisions happen very quickly, these emotional decisions. It's not the kind of cognitive decision-making that you would undertake when you go to thinking about where you're going to go to college. Schachter and Singer had this experiment that sometimes it's called the angry man, happy man experiment, where they brought these guys into a sample and they injected them with a drug. And they told the guys that, well, we're giving you this vitamin called ciproxin and we want to see how it affects you. Really what they injected them with was epinephrine, a stimulant. It's going to cause a lot of physical arousal and increased heart rate and rapid breathing and all this sort of stuff that you would associate with an emotional situation, the physiological arousal stuff. So they were able to hack the human body and trigger that. Well, then they put them into different situations in order to give them a different cognitive interpretation. So some of the guys went to a room where there was an angry dude who was throwing stuff around and ripping up surveys that they had to take. They thought he was another one of the participants in the study, but he was so angry and he stormed out of the room, and their cognitive interpretation of the situation in that room was, this is angry. Maybe I should be angry. Another condition was another set of guys went to a room where there was a guy who was just super happy and chill. and goofily making fun of stuff and playing with things in the room. He was just in a great mood. Well, afterwards, all of the people involved in this study were asked about their mood through a survey. And the people that went to the angry room were angry. They subjectively labeled their emotion as anger. And the people who went to the happy guy room subjectively labeled as happy. Well, what does this show? Well, it shows that the cognitive interpretation counts and that physiological arousal can be misinterpreted. That shaking, sweaty feeling inside could be interpreted as anger in a certain situation, and it could be interpreted as happiness in a different situation. So really, they hacked the physiological arousal and provided people with two different situations, and it created two different subjective labels. I think this is an amazing experiment, and it really shows that you can put some science to this and find out more than just these sort of crude guesses like common sense and James Lange. One that takes into account behavioral expression. It's called facial feedback theory, and it's pretty neat. It's simply that your facial expression changes how you feel. That you can make a different face and feel differently. And that's kind of a mind-blowing thing. So the shower monster situation, my face is doing crazy things, and I'm interpreting the muscle movements and becoming more afraid. So the fear may have already been there, but the facial expression is cognitively interpreted, according to this, as I should be more, and it's sort of like feedback loop happens where the person ends up feeling more of whatever the facial expression is doing. So here, this look of fear would sort of feed back into the cognitive interpretation and make the person even more afraid. I know this sounds crazy, but there's some research behind it. There is an experiment where people were asked about their mood, and then some of them were asked to put a pencil in their mouth for a period of time. And with that pencil in their mouth, they formed sort of a smile. So think about how a pencil in your mouth would make your lips curl up into something like a smile. And after a period of time, they were given another survey, and the people had increased in happiness from the earlier survey, the people who had put a pencil in their mouth versus the control group of the people who didn't. So there, they were able to change the behavioral expression by putting a pencil in a person's mouth. That, in effect, changed the cognitive interpretation. Apparently, people thought, oh, my face is forced into a smile. And that causes even more so of this subjective label of, in that case, happiness. In this case, with this face, you have some fear. So that's facial feedback theory. And then, the last one, Lazarus, Richard Lazarus's cognitive mediation theory, is basically that our appraisal of the stimulus determines the emotion, and it may even cause further physiological bodily reactions. So this guy perceives the monster to be dangerous. It's just the cognitive interpretation, and then the fear follows from there. Well, I think now would be a good time to draw your own emotional situation and label the parts. What would be the subjective label? Physiological arousal, the behavioral expression, and the cognitive interpretation. And then I would go through, how does your cartoon drawing, how does it work according to these theories? Work it out just like I did with this video. So get to it.